What is up, guys, and welcome to the first section of our Python language basics tutorials. Now we're going to divide the language basics into our 5 main sections. The first will be dealing with variables, and that's what we're going to cover in this section. So in the variables topics, we'll cover first the basic types that we'll be dealing with, then we'll take a look at some operations we can perform on numbers, and then those that we can perform on strings. Now in this section, I'm going to be talking specifically about only single value variables, so I'll save stuff like lists, tuples, ranges, all that good stuff for the next section. As well, I actually just got started in a new file. I called it variables.py, and it's in addition to my new file here. So anytime we go to run this, or at the very least the first time we go to run it, we actually want to go to our run menu, and instead of just clicking on the run here or on this run, we actually want to select the second run and then choose our variables files. This is the one we want to run. We no longer want to run new file, as that contains the stuff that we don't want. So if we go to run this, this should actually just be basically have nothing printed out here. Now I'm actually going to move my run window up to here so that I can have the two side by side. Now my code on the left and my run window on the right. So I'm just going to close up my project, make sure you have your new file started, and let's begin. So first things first, this is actually a comment, and all 4 of these lines are comments. They are anything that is preceded by this hashtag or this pound symbol, and it's basically going to be ignored by the program, ignored by the compiler. It's as if it doesn't exist. It's just kind of there for the coder and anyone else who's reading the code to read. It's a good place to leave messages and to describe what's happening in the code, although to be honest we should be writing code that's clear enough that it doesn't really need a description anyway. Actually, we can get rid of new file just by closing that and then focus on just variables. So the 2 main types or categories of variables that we're going to encounter, at least the single value stuff, is going to be numbers, so just capitalize the N there, numbers, and strings. Okay, so numbers obviously represent numerical types. These can be whole numbers or decimals. Strings are basically anything between our double quotes or single quotes, doesn't really matter which one we use in Python, and is a good way to represent text or messages within the code. There will be points in time at which we have to distinguish between the 2 numerical types, so for example integers versus stuff like floats or doubles. But we can essentially treat them as the same for the most part. Now the great thing about Python is that it's what's called weakly typed, which means we don't have to necessarily assign a specific type to each variable every time we create it. Additionally, each variable we create is completely dynamic, so we can change its value to something completely different later on in the code. As well, no need to declare constants or variables specifically. We can actually just give it a name and a value right off the bat. So, for example, if I were to create my first number, I can just call this number1, and I can give it the value of, let's say, 10. Okay? I can then later on change my number1. As you can see, if I go to type out, because it's been created already, it says variable, gives the name. I can actually reassign this to be something completely different. I can give it a string value if I want. I can have it contain the value hello. And the only problem here, which is not really a problem, it's just a warning, it's saying this is not actually used, so it's kind of a useless variable. However, it doesn't really make much sense to store a string value within a variable called number1, so I'm going to call this string1 and just have it contain a string value. So this is a numerical value, it's 10, we can actually add decimals onto here, 10.0, 10.1, whatever we want, and this is a string, hello, is between the double quotes, or additionally we could put it between the single quotes, doesn't really matter too much, and again it's just containing some kind of text or message. For the purpose of some of these calculations we're going to perform, I'm just going to create a number2, and I'll set this equal to, let's say, 7. Now, some of the basic operations we can perform on variables include stuff like the following. So we'll have basic addition, subtraction, division, and multiplication. Then we can do stuff like the modulus, which basically returns the remainder of a division. We can perform exponential calculations. And finally, we can perform floor division, which basically discards any kind of remainder. Now, some of these can actually be performed on strings, namely the addition operator. This can be used to what's called append or stick 2 strings together. We'll take a look at an example of that in just a second. Now, most of these results will just call on print, so print some kind of result, and that is just going to print whatever result we set to the console over here. So, for example, if I said just print out my current value of number1, and I go ahead and run this now because I set my settings to be running our variables file here, I could just click on the run now, and as you can see 10 gets printed out there. So let's just go over some really quick examples of some operations we can perform. So let's print number1 plus number2, okay, and I'm just going to copy this a bunch of times, and I'll do it 7 times, okay. We're going to do number2 minus number1, or actually number1 is the bigger one, so we can do number1 minus number2, do a multiply, divide, we can raise this to the exponential. Okay, we'll do actually modulus was next. We'll do the exponential one here. And finally, we'll do the floor division. And let's just see what the results of each of these will be. So if we go to run it, Then as you can see, 17 is the addition, then the subtraction, multiplication. This is going to be the division. The modulus will basically return the remainder, so 10 divided by 7 would be 1 with a remainder of 3. That's why we get 3 printed out. This is 10 raised to the 7th power, and then because this is going to be the floor division, which will basically discard the remainder. 10 into 7 is 1, and we throw away that remainder of 3. Additionally, like I said, we can actually concatenate or append strings together. So if I said something like string 1 plus guys, okay, and then went to run that again, then as you can see, hello guys gets printed out right there. So every time we call print, unless we do some fancy printing, this is going to print whatever we set in these brackets on a new line, as you can see. I'm going to get in some print tips and tricks right at the very end, once we've finished with all of our language basics. But for now, this is a very convenient way to print things out, and it's totally flexible. Like I said, you can put in 2 variable values like this. You can put in a mix of variable and literal values. This is called a literal string because it's a literal string value. And then we can put in the mix of variables and literals, or you can actually just have literals. So just print the number 5 and it'll print the number 5 there. So these are some basic numerical operations. Now let's take a look at some string operations we can perform on strings like this. So to help us out, I'm actually going to take a string 2. And I'm going to have this say something a little more complicated, and we'll have it say something like, Python is a great programming, let's see if I can spell programming right, programming language. Okay. Now, first of all, we might want the length of a string, so I'm actually just going to comment these all out. By the way, I just use a hotkey there, command, and the / question mark key. We'll comment everything out, and we can just kind of toggle that comment state. So now none of these print statements will be executed, and we're just going to move on to our next stuff down here. So we've already seen we can add strings together or append one string onto the end of another. Again, we might want the length of a string, so we can actually just print len, okay, which is going to be short for length. And then we can stick a string in here, such as if we print string 1, for example, this should return the result of 5. We go ahead and run that, and as you can see, 5 is going to be printed out right there. Now, if we don't want to go up here every time, by the way, Control-R will just automatically run your program. So pressing Control-R right now, you can see that it ran and printed our results there. Okay, so some other operations we might want to perform on strings. I'm going to put all of these in separate print statements. So if I start typing string 1 or string 2, then just the name of a string, dots, then I get this list of options to choose from. So I can capitalize it if I want. I could do something like string 2 dot. Find is something we'll often want to do, so if I'm trying to find some string within here, let's see if I can find the string Python in there. Some other stuff we might want to do, just going to put this on a separate line. If we again string 2 dot, and then we can scroll through stuff like is alpha, is decimal. These will tell you obviously if the string is an alpha string, so we can do that, and then also do the decimal, so is something like decimal. Next up, we might want to replace items in our string, so we could do something like, again, string 2 dot replace, and we can put something like great. Let's trying to replace great with something like fantastic. Okay. Some other things we might want to do, print string 2 dot, and then something like split is a pretty good one. This will just basically form an array, and will split our each of the items up based on, let's say we want to split them based on a space. So every time it finds a space, it'll create a new item in an array. So let's just go ahead and run these guys. So again, a Control-R will run all of them, and it will perform the necessary operations. So again, appended stuff to it. This is printing out the number of characters in our string 1. Python is a great programming language. It's just printing this out, but now capitalized. So you know that P was capitalized there. That was this call here. If in the second one after this, this is going to find the word Python and return the index at which it starts, which indeed is 0, as Python is the first character, or I guess the first substring in this string here. Next is alphanumeric and is decimal both return false as expected. It's now got the string and replaced great with fantastic there. And finally, the split based on the spaces is now going to take each of the strings found within this major string and create a new item in an array here. So those are your single value variable basics. Like I said, the two major types, numbers and strings. There are slight partitions again between the numerical types, such as floats and doubles and integers. So floats and doubles are the decimal numbers, integers are the whole numbers. And then strings, again, anything between the double quotes and the single quotes. Generally, we'll be printing out the results of these operations we performed, just to get kind of familiar with what we can and can't do with these variables. So what I'd recommend you do is play around with these guys a little bit, try these operations on some literal values and some variable values, see what you can and can't do, and get familiar with these two types. Hopefully, as you can see already, Python is a very flexible language, seeing as we can pretty easily perform these operations and add things together and stuff like that. So once you're comfortable with both strings and numbers, we'll move on to the next section, which will be multi-value variables. So we'll take a look at stuff like lists, ranges, and tuples, which will again provide us a way to store lots of values within a single variable.